Good morning, or nearly good afternoon. I've been asked to talk about, as a case study, about a Middle Eastern oil company who, for legal reasons, I can't say their name. We had a project which was for a year's project, but it turned out to be 18 months, typical for Saudi Arabia, where we had to redesign a big training facility. I have to do it this way because for some reason PowerPoint won't work on a Mac. So my name is Frank Sheehan, CEO consultant. As you can see, I've got one of them little certificates that I can hang on my wall. The principal consultant and the CEO of Hypersphere, based in the UK. Various offices around various different destinations. Spend most of my time either in the Middle East and now further afield. We are predominantly from the AV world, I guess. Spent the last 20 years working in big visualization, doing big projects that are like virtual reality, cave virtual environments, all that kind of stuff. The oil and gas fellas, they use obviously the virtual environments and big visualization a lot for either just for training, like these guys were using it for, or they use it for analysing data. Drilling engineers use it a lot for downhole management, geologists for seismic data, all that kind of stuff. So they use big viz in lots of ways for various different reasons. And it saves them millions and millions of dollars, so it's good return on investment. So that's kind of infamous in. So about Hypersphere, as we were just saying, what we're doing is kind of give you a quick thing of what asks visualization, high performance computing, graphics, experience service design, implementation, operational kind of stuff. So we are very much a human-led approach to technology and design, uniting people with technology. Those are the kind of things that we do. We're a team built up of IT professionals and AV professionals, so we cover both worlds. And so for us, the SDVoE sits quite nicely into both worlds for us. So, project. Large training facility for oil and gas company. Facility promoting, the thing is the focus of them, they want to be more collaborative. One of the issues they had for their working process, I was involved with this project back in 2007, 2008, where they had this one to be collaborative and do all these wonderful, cool things. Unfortunately, what happened was it was bid out, and the integrator that did it changed the designs, and it got the client to agree to it. And what they ended up with was this kind of really heavy, non-collaborative training facility with the usual kind of didactic teaching techniques. And as you can see, they had like 2 lots of computers under each desk, because for the training they could be either teaching drilling engineers or petrophysicists or geologists, carrying capture and stuff. So the amount of data and stuff they did was quite high. You had 2 machines, one was Linux and one was Windows PC based. Their idea of collaboration was sitting at desks with flip charts, basically. That was basically their idea of collaboration. Not really what you would think as taking us further forward in the future. So one of the other things also, which was thrown as a bit of a curveball into our scope of works, was the interior design as well, which we use an interior design company based in the UK to help us through with taking this project forward. So it was really important for us to work in parallel and together with the interior designer. And the reason for that is that because the client wanted the technology to be totally integrated into their surroundings, so that basically the interior design and the infrastructure and the building and technology were one. There was none of this kind of, right, okay, we're going to put wallpaper up on the wall and we're just going to hang screens willy-nilly. It all had to be completely and utterly integrated together seamlessly. So design brief. So design brief was it had to be flexible, it had to be scalable, untethered high quality audio. So the audio was part of all this as well, because the rooms were very totally non-collaborative, as we pointed out, and not just from a visual perspective, but from an audio perspective. An example was that you have a training facility, a training room rather, and for some of these students, they would reenact the Deepwater Horizon event. but from the oil and gas perspective, not from a Hollywood perspective. And they would have one of the principal instructors would be up in his office on the 4th floor, and these guys would be down on the 2nd floor, and in a classroom. And via the network, what would happen was he would be the guy up in the 4th floor would be the rig supervisor, and he would be relaying messages about what's going on in the rig. And back in the command and control room on the 2nd floor, these students would have to figure out what they were going to do next. But they couldn't capture, so there was a problem with the sound. He could see them because there was a camera, so they could see what was going on, but they couldn't capture what was being said because the instructor had, like me, had this lapel mic thing, which the instructors used to hate wearing. And so there became this kind of way of where the instructor, when the students would say something, so that the guy upstairs could hear what was being said, he would say, so you're saying we should do this then, and this kind of stuff. There was kind of a real kind of awkward kind of way of doing it. So there was a real big problem with the audio side of things. Visually, as you saw before, so they had these projection things, and they had these projectors hanging from the ceiling. Yes, they are Christie projectors, but they were, unfortunately, they were noisy. So the instructor was saying there there was all sorts of issues with the audio. Contrast was crap because of lighting, and it was just so many things about this whole thing which made it really kind of, it was actually quite a depressing place, to be quite honest with you. So these are the things they wanted. So they wanted to be stimulating in a collaborative environment. They had to be really interesting. You know, the instructors were standing there, and I actually sat in one of the classes, and it was quite interesting, because they had all these screens on the desks and everything else, and his didactic learning. The instructor was standing there talking to these guys, and in typical Saudi fashion, they just didn't give a monkeys, and they weren't particularly paying attention because it wasn't particularly interesting and stimulating and interactive. So he was talking, and these guys were kind of hiding behind their screens, chitter-chattering. It was quite extraordinary. This guy was talking to himself, a bit like I do most of the time. But anyway, they wanted to be stimulating and interesting for people, for the students. Also, it'd be a common setup. It was always a lot of faff. You know, when they want to do an instruction and do anything, it was always difficult. If they brought an instructor out from the outside, he'd come along like I did with a thumb drive and say, I want to plug this in. And one of the principal problems is typical of that organisation is all USBs are blocked. So you'd have to get a certain guy with a certain amount of administration rights. He used to come down, log in the machine, plug it in, and it was painful. So it was, and so they wanted to make it be much more flexible and easier in that respect. Building wide. So as you saw before, it was just mostly to do with that room. And so if you wanted to do something in another room, or you wanted to do an extension of that lesson because you had an overflow into another classroom, they couldn't do it. And the reasons for that was because they were using a capture system to capture the lessons. But when they stringed it, there was such a latency. It was like a 2-second latency. So if somebody put their hand up in the room next door, the guy was already on the next slide and whittering on about something else. So there was a real problem with them about being able to share stuff throughout the building. It had to be user-friendly and seamless and simple. When you looked at their control screen, it was just so difficult. It was clearly designed by an engineer and not by someone who actually wants to use it on a day-to-day basis. So you'd get a guy turn up with his thumb drive, as I said, or a USB stick, and do a presentation. He hasn't got a clue how to use the screen because it's so difficult. It wasn't user-friendly. And typically what happened was the guys that used to come in to do the outside guys, they were experts who had retired. So they're like guys of 60 and 70 years old and complete technophobes. So to come in and plug in a USB stick, and he's like, what am I going to do? Because he can't use the technology. So it had to be high quality in a professional environment and up to date and with appropriate technology. And not only that, it had to be scalable. Nick spoke about that earlier. And how you make something, the client says, we want it to be future-proof. But how do you make something technologically future-proof? You can't. But what you can do is you can design it in such a way, which is what we did with here, is not to design the future out, which is a very different way of looking at it. So one of the things we looked at and focused a huge amount on is infrastructure. So I kind of stole this from Justin. Well, also I got this actually from our friends at SDVoE. This is what I was been using when I was in India and all sorts of places. So yesterday the old. So that's kind of what they've currently got now. I like that. They've got these huge monolithic switches, transmitters, and all this other stuff. And it was just a video wall. They had the Christie Spider, the X20s, which were great in their day, but they're just no, from a future perspective, forget it, because it's just difficult. So now, of course, we went this particular route. And as you can see, yeah, you've got Terra transmitters and Terra receivers. So I'm flying the flag for Christie. Donations which we received later, thank you. Beer tokens. So the idea being, also the other thing was like how one of the issues was like having these computers that were everywhere in the rooms as well, as you saw underneath the desks. How do we get rid of all that crap and make the rooms all nice and lightweight, easy to use, and everything else? So obviously this is the way to go. Now there was we did do tests. We did do tests with the client had Crestron go in there and do their pitch and show their extenders, and they kind of worked. And there was all the other manufacturers that went in, but there was issues why they decided to go this way, and I'll talk about the reason why the SDVoE worked out better for them in a while. But needless to say, obviously, one of the things that was really of interest to them was being able to get things. Latency was a real big issue for them, and how much compression you would use. That was another big issue for what they wanted to do. Because of the kind of data they show, and you look at the kind of applications they use on a day-to-day basis. Being able to do stuff really, really quick, and I hate to use the word lossless, but as lossless as you're likely to get, as best as you're likely to get, and so this technology seems to be worked out the best for them. And there was another reason for why it was a good way to choose this technology. So the technology. So one of the things we looked at, there was about limiting physically on the learning environment. So we focused a lot, as I mentioned earlier, on the infrastructure. So we moved all the PC and workstations and the laptops from all the classrooms. There was in excess of 500 PC workstations in that facility, in all the different classrooms. It was about 22 classrooms in all, plus other ancillaries. There's also a AV control room where they have the AV guys sit there and they monitor all the systems of all the classrooms. And there was a computer room, which I was involved with designing back in 2006 to 2007, which had about 3 racks in it, and it had all this cooling and everything else in there. So the idea being was, what we wanted to do is take all the workstations and all that crap and chuck it in the computer room. And also, the other thing also was, there's all these computers and the workstations they were using. One of the issues they had was that they just had these things sitting there and they weren't actually being utilised. So how could they actually utilise and manage the resources, the PC resources, rather than just sitting there using up CPU time, spinning disks and doing nothing? Why not actually use them in some constructive way? Really use the assets of the building as much as possible. So one of the things we looked at was about using VDI and using PC over IP. And the other thing also, because they wanted to go 4K, rather than using the projection thing, they decided that what was better for them overall was that to use flat panels displays. Projection was too fixed for them, so what they wanted to be able to do is they'll have a couple of big 98s in the room, and then they have a whole bunch of other 70s, and that way you can wheel around and do stuff. And actually, also, how do you take what you're showing on this screen, for instance, and say, right, okay, well, we've got it on this screen, but why don't we actually also put it out to all the screens on their desks? So that way, everybody gets it. Everybody gets it, and not only that, if you take that and say, right, okay, we're showing this, and we'll take that and we'll throw it in the room next door, and throw it into their screens, on their desks, and so on and so on and so on. How do you do that around the whole building? And so what became really appropriate is that, okay, with a mixture of PC over IP for the general IT side of things. For the AV side of things, we'll go this route, by doing PC over IP, AV over IP. And so this. So the other thing also was about USB. Now, interestingly, as I said, there's a lockdown in USB, but about keyboard and mouse, and there's also cameras. And there was also the fact is that as there was control, and there was audio, because we were about audio, and so one of the things they want to do is audio everywhere. So, okay, that went down a QSys route, and we used the Shure MX ceiling tiles and all this kind of stuff. So you had audio everywhere, video everywhere, and it's all done because we put it on the network. Now, there were two challenges also associated with the network side of things. These guys had a draconian, and I mean the draconian IT department, who completely forbid any of this to go anywhere near their core network, which is fine, fair enough. So a separate network was set up. They already had a gigabit Ethernet system in there, and so they then went into the planning about how do we then put in a 10 gig structure. So now this facility has a 10 gig network and a gigabit Ethernet network. PC over IP sits on the gigabit Ethernet. AV over IP sits on the 10 gig. And so now we have this, this kind of crossover between the two. But equally also is that these machines, these are little extenders from the likes of ZV, DVI, Gear, Christian, I mean, they've already got a gigabit pass-through, so why not use that? So then control and everything else. So what happens is that this little box of tricks does a whole bunch of other things other than just doing the video. So, so then we became the backbone of the AV. You know, we were this true convergence of the whole thing, and how that we brought this together. It was really complicated. A lot of the meetings and discussions were held with the IT guy, trying to get them to understand what we're going to do. There was between the different the different floors, there were the telco rooms where they had big pipe fibre running between them. It says 40 gig and greater. They're now looking at, they're starting to push 100 gig between them. Network switches, Netgear was not allowed. IT rules, don't ask me why. We designed this system using a company called Brocade, their switches, which actually now is Ruckus, who've been subsequently bought and sold several times since. But the integrator decided to go extreme. It was extreme too, but extreme using extreme switches. And as it says there, you know, PC workstations racked in the main building computer room. So all this stuff, all these taken out all these rooms and put in and racked. And so now when they use the classrooms, it's a shared resource. There's no longer all these things, so it's all done with the control and everything else for the software for the management of the AV system was done on it using a VM, virtual machine. So everything became very IT centric. So as I say, they're using the 10 gig as well as the gigabit. And the idea being is now they started on the path in putting the 10 gig network in there. So now there's a scalable progression now. So there is a position where they're about now, where they're just about, the integrator's just about finishing off the job now. And so there's a path now where we've done there's going to be a transition between the gigabit Ethernet and the 10 gig, which is the path they're going to go down. So now, so as you can see there, as I said, at this point, what's been the integrators put in there are ZV boxes. That's what they put in there. And there was a reason for that, why the choice when that went out to bid over a year ago. As you can see, there's a whole bunch of stuff going there, and then there's the PC over IP, which is a different technology. Again, it's IP based, but that was around a company called Amulet Hotkey, but I believe they're using, I think they've gone the Dell, which is actually an Amulet Hotkey system rebadged. So technology providers. Now, I said to you before that there was a reason for why the client wanted to go down the route of using the SDVoE technology. And the reason for it was, apart from the fact is that where Crestron and others were using gigabit Ethernet, and saying we can do it. There was an issue over the obviously the latency. They thought was latency, and they weren't happy about all the artifacts that they were getting with the Crestron and others using gigabit. And I'm not knocking them technology. You know, in their application, they work really well, and good luck to that. It depends on what the application. But this client, they had really, really high expectations and really were very fussy, and they were very particular about the kind of content they were going to show and how it looked. So equally also was that the biggest is one of the big reasons for it is that there was all these manufacturers, these companies, and there is more than this now, of course, because this is a bit old. This particular slide. So when it went out to bid, the client had a particular rule as part of their procurement process, which was sole sourcing. So if there was a particular projector or particular switch or a particular anything that you had said that you had to have, and there was only one supplier of that thing, the bloody paperwork you had to go through was just beyond imagination, just to get the permission to be able to sole source. So for us, it was easy. So okay, well, at that time, ZV was the one that had been around the longest, which is one of the reasons why the client decided to go that route. But equally also, as I pointed out to them, because I knew as a consultant, talking to SDVoE, or what was then just the Semtech, or what they got called before now. Anyway, talking to them, there was all these other manufacturers who were part of it. So I said, look, keep your eye out, because there's going to be about 4 or 5 others that are going to be doing it. Christie, DVI Gear, and so on and so on and so on. There's going to be all these others. And sure enough, they all released their products at ISE, and the client went to ISE and made their thumbs up, thank you, Frank. And so it went out to tender based on using that technology. Now, there were various different people put in various different bids. The client was kind of leading to themselves, although they didn't sole source. They kind of went to ZV purely because it had been around, technically the longest out in the market. So it was thought that they'd ironed out all the bugs before everybody else did. Outcomes. So the outcome was basically that didactic, horrible, stifling rooms that you saw earlier now have been transformed. Everything, there was no workstations. They got furniture that you could move and change around. If they want to do didactic learning, they can do didactic, put them in rows like this. Or they can put them into small clusters where they can get people working in small groups to solve problems. So the idea was to actually, so one of the issues as an oil and gas company is how do you bring people together to work on solutions rather than working in their silos? Because if you've ever been to any of these oil and gas companies, particularly in the Middle East, you've got these guys in their little rooms in their cupboards, and they're very siloed. How do you get people out and working together on problems rather than just fixing on his problem? How do you get them to understand? So the idea here was to actually do this. So these were all touch screens, so they can get up and present their little things. And the other thing also, which was of real interest to the client, is now they can take any of these, put any of these presentations or any of these pieces, so the instructor can now walk around the room. He can talk, and he doesn't have to wear one of these anymore. He just walks around the room because he's got MX tiles everywhere. Students can be heard, although they've got to be careful what they say because they can be overheard if they're saying anything, of course. But of course, as a control functionality, it's a programmable thing. You just say, okay, I'm doing presentation, so you turn all the other tiles off, but you have the ones at the front on, for instance. So now you've got this ability now to be able to hear and see everything anywhere. The instructor can walk around, and if he's talking to a particular group, he'll see something on one of their screens and say, that's really cool. Send him its class, and he can then, on his touch screen, press a button, and he can then push it out to all the other screens in the room. He can push it out to the rest of the bloody building if he wants. But the fact of the matter is his ability to be able to share anything anywhere, which was the really exciting and interesting thing. This is kind of a bit of a box diagram how that particular room worked. So here we have this thing where we've got this computer room thing where you've got this all stuffed away. You've got other pieces of boxes and extenders put in various different places, and then you've got the core building network. The other thing also was what's ended up happening is how do we manage that? And as I said to you at the beginning about segregation, the client didn't want any kind of virtualization of the network. He didn't want any VLANs. VLANs are not allowed. So we had to have a segregation between the AV network and the IT network. But equally also, the IT guys wanted to be able to see what's going on in the AV network. So the latest thing that's kind of been going on, this latest discussions is there's been a firewall that's been created between the two networks. So now there's the ability for the IT guys, they can see what's going on the AV network, but there is a kind of a segregation. So that it's configured in such a way. So no more no VLANing, it's complete solid network, and there is a connection between the Corp network and the AV network. It's just the way that the AV network was structured. Fortunately at the time, when this was done, I had a good friend of mine who's sitting at the back, remain nameless, was part of this journey with the IT and trying to educate these fellas. You know how you could, because they were really archaic, and they said, well, you don't have to do it this way, or you can structure, if you structure the network and how you configure the switches in a certain way, and that's kind of what's happened. And so in the end, what happened as part of the requirements and the end goal, we end up being the vision. The client now gets what they want, and it's going to be when it really goes fully online. It's being used now, but when it goes when they go to ribbon cut and they're going to get some king, I think, I think it's the Crown Prince at the moment, who's the one that's going to come in and open it, I believe. I don't suppose I'll be allowed to go there because of for obvious reasons. So, key lessons. So, separation of technology, built-in environment, client teams making integration harder. So, one of the issues you've got, of course, is that the technology. The client is very technological, very but they are very. One of the issues you have with having a technical client is understanding the construction side of it. Because as I said before, one of the things we were involved with was actually the interior design and changing the room, putting in raised floors, putting in infrastructure, putting floor boxes in, and a whole bunch of stuff. And so the other thing also with facilities people, and I know everybody has been in this, understands this, the facilities is about lack of understanding of technology. So on one side you've got a tech client who's frustrated with the facilities guy, and you've got the facilities guy who's frustrated with the technology guy. And then I'm sitting in the middle as like a marriage guidance counsellor between these two, trying to make sure they're all happy and they're singing on the same song sheet. And obviously is needed, and having a good user representation throughout with the client. Basically, the idea is having someone that holds their hand all the way through, takes them through their journey. And the final key lesson is, just as a bit of amusement, is on the site, is that remember always wear the hard hat. It stops you from being dead. And so with that, I thank you and hope you enjoy the rest of the show.